We're about to move into the third wonder, that is to say, the third conspicuous miracle that occurs around the time of the second coming of Christ, that was revealed to Daniel in his prophecy, almost start to finish. Because what he saw in the second chapter from Nebuchadnezzar's dream is an overview that correlates with what we're speaking about at the end of Daniel in chapters 11 and 12. So the third wonder doesn't look like a wonder when you read it in the text. The king of the south pushes. What's conspicuous and miraculous about that? Until you look closely at what this is actually happens. And then you understand what an amazing event in the history of the world this will be when it finally occurs. The south pushes. You've got to know what that means in order to understand the depth of it. So the third wonder is specifically the king of the south attacks. It's Jesus. Now there are different views on who the king of the south is. I'm going to hang with Dr. Thomas on this one and assert, but not dogmatically. I'm just going to assert for purposes of this discussion that the king of the south is Jesus. And the king of the south pushes, it's an attack, and Jesus begins his rule in the midst of his enemies. Now, I'm going to explain why I make that assertion, even though there are other ideas. You know, each of us are free to formulate our own idea about what's going to happen with these prophecies. We all generally agree, but as to the specifics, there are variations of view. Interestingly enough, there are variations of view even with the same person. For example, when Dr. Thomas wrote Elpis Israel in 1848, he thought the king of the south was Egypt. Later on, he thought it possibly was England in a protectorate position over Egypt. When he wrote Eureka, he finally decided that the king of the south was Christ. And I have his reasoning enclosed in this morning's discussion. So you see why it's not unreasonable to suggest that the king of the south is Christ. Why is it a wonder? This king of the south pushes. Why is that a wonder? What makes that, to use the scriptural definition of the word wonder, what makes that a conspicuous miracle in the time of the second coming of Christ? Well, because that particular event is Christ's initial military insertion into world politics. He's here. He's a physical being, not a spiritual being, like John said. And he's taking a militaristic approach to his rulership, which is unthinkable in the Christian world as to who Christ is. Of what people who don't know who Christ is, or aren't even Christian, would think of a military insertion by Christ into world politics. But that insertion is necessary because he's going to subjugate the nations to his authority. It begins, this is the beginning of the crushing of the serpent's head. Now, does everybody in here remember what that's a reference to? That's an allusion to Genesis 3:15, where God said that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head, but it would bruise his heel. When Jesus came the first time and was crucified and nailed on the cross, he had described that event as being the ruler of this world is cast out. Two things happened that cast out the ruler of this world. And that's a double entendre, if you want to put it that way. The first way the ruler of this world was cast out, which was the crushing of the heel of the serpent, was that Jesus was the ruler of this world and he was cast out by his fellow brethren in Israel. He was nailed to the cross by an unjust trial that put him into an execution process, and then he was put to death. He was the true ruler of the world and he was cast out. He was cast out because the serpent, the wickedness of the Pharisees, who were the snakes of his time, and the wickedness of the serpent power, the Roman Empire, and their complete lack of faith and understanding in the things of God, bruised the heel of the seed of the woman by nailing him to the cross. And he was, in fact, wounded through his heel. In some depictions of the crucifixion, the spike went through his heel. It's close enough anyway for that picture to be very sensible as an interpretation. So how was the other ruler of this world cast out? He was cast out because in Hebrews 2:14, it says that when Jesus was crucified, he put to death him that hath the power of death, that is the devil. So there's another sense in which this is a double entendre, and that is the devil is the current ruler of this world, and nobody will deny that. This world is ruled much more than it is by good. It's a dichotomy, and people can see that there's good in this world, even though it appears, with all the wars and the destruction and the abuse and the unhappiness and the weakness of men and their conflicts, from internal conflicts in the individual through conflicts in families to conflicts in nations, left and right, Republicans and Democrats, to conflicts between ideologies in differing nations. The world is ruled essentially under an environment of almost total conflict. The fact that we haven't destroyed ourselves yet doesn't mean that we don't have the capacity to, that is, men, humankind, or that we won't eventually. Jesus, in fact, said if he didn't come back, we would destroy ourselves. All flesh would perish. So that's the ruler of this world. But he was cast out when Jesus put him to death on the cross. Unfortunately, when Jesus cast out the devil was still very much alive. He destroyed it in himself, and he overcome the battle which would lead to the overcoming of sin in this world in the ultimate sense at the end of time when all flesh praises the Lord. But having destroyed the devil in the action he took on the cross did not remove the influence of human nature or the devil from the world. And so for 2,000 years the world has continued to suffer under that ruler. But he did cast him out when he was crucified. So the question is, will the ruler of this world please stand up? And 3 days later, the real ruler of the world did stand up when he was raised from his grave. So once again, why is it a wonder for the king of the south to push? Well, taking the premise that Jesus is that king of the south, it's the event, this pushing is the event of Christ's initial military insertion into world politics by which he subjugates the nations to his authority. It begins the crushing of the serpent's head. By the time he's seated on his throne, literally, and his throne is inclusive of a royal administration that has taken complete control of the world and bound this kings in fetters, as it says in Psalm 2, by that time, he will have crushed the serpent's head. And there's only one time when that serpent sort of regains his energy, and that's at the end of the 1,000 years, when there is another effort to offset the throne of Christ, and that effort is foiled. Christ is, there's a judgment that judges all those people who have lived in faith during the millennium, and then at the end of that time, there won't be anybody alive who does not possess the nature of God and has become a son or daughter of God. And that time is described as myriads and myriads of people whom no man can wonder. And that's the ultimate manifestation of God's life and character into those that have been drawn out of the soil of this world and elevated into the life of God. So this is the actual text in Daniel, in the 40th verse of chapter 11. Now that's several verses earlier than the one we spoke of as the second miracle when Michael stands up. But when all that we've described in the last 3 weeks of Michael standing up, meaning the coalescing of the saints, the judgment and the formation of his army, that has to be in place in order for the king of the south to begin his push into the nations. So this is what it says in that verse. And at that time, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Him is the king of the north. And that word push means attack, and I'll show you exactly why I'm saying that in a minute. Shall push at him, the king of the north, and the king of the north shall rush upon him, the king of the south. In other words, he will retaliate like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, that is the countries of his dominion, his forced dominion, and shall overflow and pass over. All of that, the second half of this verse is describing the actions of the king of the north that were prompted initially by the king of the south pushing at him. So in other words, when you get to Ezekiel 38 and it says, I will put hooks in your jaws, O Gog, chief prince of Gog and Magog, and bring you down. That's an act. That statement describes an action that Jesus takes when he's here. He puts the hooks in the jaws of the king of the north, that is the bridle, and he turns him around and brings him. Turning around is a little bit difficult to understand, but he somehow or another, with the same level of control that a rider has over his horse, he brings the king of the north south. He does this by pushing at him. So when he pushes at him, this king of the north, this hostile Gogian power from the uttermost parts of the north, as described in Ezekiel 38, makes a responsive assault. And he'd been planning to do this all along, like a whirlwind, with chariots, in other words, with the armaments of war, and with his vehicles of war, in this case referred to in archaic language, horsemen, and with many ships. That's probably literal because he comes through the Mediterranean as well as down from the Black Sea over those countries which are immediately north of Israel, with horsemen and with many ships, and he will enter into the countries, that is, the countries that he is dominating at the time, and overflow and pass over. It's interesting that I think in this, if it's not this week, it's just recently that we've learned that Russia is increasing the number of ships that Russia has in the Mediterranean Sea. They're lining up for something, and there are more ships there now than there were just recently. So that's recently in the news, and I think it's significant to this verse because there's a direct correlation between the increase of Russia's naval power in the Mediterranean and an increase of its dominance, for example, in Syria and in its relationship with Turkey, and now its new energy relationship with Germany. This is incredibly significant because it will place Germany in a it will make Germany functionally beholden to Russia, and Germany has received a lot of criticism by the U.S. for this particular action or relationship that it just established. This is all in the news this year. So that's the way it's described in Daniel chapter 11. Of this particular event, and speaking of the saints and Christ together as the force that initiates all this, this is what Brother Thomas said in Eureka. Speaking of Christ and the saints, and the judgment that took place in the south, in Sinai, he said, developed in the south as a body of kings. All right, so this is Jesus and his army, Lord of hosts, laying special claim to the land of Israel and to the world in general. Okay, so why would the Lord of hosts lay special claim to the land of Israel? Because it's been promised to him since the time of Abraham. Jesus is that special seed to which the promise was made to Abraham directly when he said, look around north, south, east, and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your seed who is Christ forever. And we read at the end of Galatians 3 that it's not only to Abraham and to his seed, but if you're baptized, you're also heirs according to the promise. So Christ and his saints have an expectation at the time of the second coming of Christ of claiming the land of Israel and to the world in general and commencing their enterprise for the conquest of their rights from Teman. That's another prophecy we'll get into later. They come up from Sinai and they come through Teman, which is in the south, the southern part of Jordan. And they constitute a power. That power is the power that is embodied in the Lord of hosts as an army, styled in Daniel 11:40. And this is where he makes his reference to the king of the south as Melech HaNegev, king of the south. So that I'm guessing, I didn't check this out before I came here this morning, but I think Melech Henegeth is the original Hebrew for the term king of the south. So that's what he says. It's a body of kings that developed in the south, and they are now laying special claim to the land of Israel. Well, when Jesus comes into this world and he makes a claim of the land of Israel, he's going to have to do that in very literal terms. Somehow or another, there's going to be an effort by Christ, which is a great work that he has that lies before him when he comes, to claim the land of Israel as his own. Well, who's there now? The state of Israel is there now. The Palestinians believe it's theirs. Iran and the entire Muslim empire believe it belongs to them. Russia would like to have it for its economic value. So are they just going to say, oh, the land is yours? And who are you anyway, by the way? Because they don't believe Christ can come back from heaven. They don't even believe he's alive. None of them. None of the Muslims. Nobody in Israel except maybe, not even the conservative Jews in Israel believe that Jesus is the one who's going to come back and claim it. They believe Messiah will. But Russia certainly doesn't believe that it's possible for Jesus to suddenly appear in the world. So what happens when he's here and somehow or another he makes it apparent that the land belongs to him and he's going to take it by force? He's going to do that because force is the only way he can take it. Palestinians aren't going to say, okay, here, you can have the land. The state of Israel's not going to do it. I know in particular that Barak, who came and gave a lecture in Chrysler Hall, I've referred to this before, he said no angel from heaven is going to come down and save Israel, so we're going to have to save ourselves. That's a totally humanistic perspective. I know Netanyahu, I know Netanyahu is familiar with prophecies, but he certainly doesn't believe that Jesus is going to come one day and claim the land, because he's the president of Israel. You know the powers that be that in the armies that come against Jerusalem to battle in that day, they're not going to believe that Jesus can come. So force is the only way he can take it. The only language that men in this world understand is military language. They understand that language very well. You go to battle and whoever wins gets the spoil. So that's going to happen in this moment. And that's why he goes, that's the manner in which he goes to claim the land. So this is also how, this is fascinating, this quotation. Just look in a nutshell how Brother Thomas saw the wonder of this action. Just get this. Picture this as a real condition in the world we live in sometime in the very near future. Sudden and unexpected attack of a hitherto unheard of power, that's Jesus and his army, will come upon the kings of the earth and the whole habitable as a thief. In other words, he's there, he's acting as king, and they don't know who this is. He's like a thief in the house that came in while you were sleeping. Suddenly they wake up and there's a thief in the house. That's Jesus. Who's this? The situation will be an astounding novelty in the balance of power. Going to throw that balance way off in the way the kings of this world see it. The Christ in fullness, that when he says the Christ, he's not talking about Jesus as an individual. When he says the Christ in fullness is God manifested in Jesus and his saints to become Yahweh Elohim, the mighty ones, and Yahweh Tzebaoth, the army of God. In his fullness, that's the Christ. That's why Paul said, you are Christ, because you're inclusive in the bigger picture of God manifesting himself in this host of people. All right, so let's start that sentence again. The Christ in fullness, that is with his saints, in Babylon, that is in the ruling powers of the Middle East at the time, and none suspecting even that the Lord Jesus had individually descended from heaven. Could any surprise be more complete? The drama of that so far surpasses the drama of Joseph's brothers suddenly realizing that it was Joseph who was second in command in all of Egypt, and that is drama enough. This drama is 1,000 times greater. And by God's good grace, we will all be there to witness this firsthand. So you're starting to see why this is going to be a pretty significant, miraculous event in its time, in the moment that it happens. That brings us to a closer look at this word pushing. Because you remember, the king of the south pushes. So what does that mean? Well, you can get a little bit out of the original in this case on the meaning of the word pushing. Let's look at the text again. At the time of the end, the king of the south will push at him, and that word means attack. Why do we say that? Because push could mean political influence. It could mean some kind of verbal rhetoric. Why do we think that means a physical attack? Well, it goes into the meaning of the word push. In Hebrew, that word is nagach, which means to butt with the horns, to gore as an ox, or to war against. Well, this then starts to be very interesting now, because one of the four faces of Christ is the face of an ox. And we've spoken many times of that ox being a symbol of a humble servant. An ox is a worker beast. It's not really like a bull, which is an aggressive, violent beast, at least in the ring with a bullfighter. But an ox is a powerful worker beast. And so he's understood as kind of being humble because he takes the yoke of his burden that is placed upon him by his masters, and he just gets the work done. He never stops. He's a tireless working beast. In this case, though, in this meaning, the ox isn't a worker beast. He's a beast that retaliates with his horns and butts and gores. So you can imagine what would happen if this powerful beast got mad at you or at something and gored it with his horns. Well, you could think that, I'm not sure, but I think I've seen an amazing YouTube video of taken in Africa of a lion and an ox duking it out in a personal conflict. And the ox picks up the lion or a leopard or a cheetah with his horns. He gores the cat beast and throws and flips him over, and the cat runs away. So they're good when they work. They seem to be relatively harmless, but if they ever get upset, they're very powerful. So it's interesting that these are two qualities of Jesus when he comes back. He's, the humble servant that we all know and love from the past, but he can hardly force the nations in subjection to him by being humble. He has to operate as a king now, and his military insertion in this world is going to have a completely different nature than the one that Christianity at large expects. They expect him to come as the beautiful lamb-like personality that he was always here for the most part, and just take a rapture and go away. That's why this is going to be the worst time in the history of the world to believe in the devil. Because the kings of this world at that time, when they see Christ behaving like this, pushing at the king of the north, that's not going to fit the profile that they expect Jesus to have at the time of his coming. And so they're going to think that this is more consistent with their concept of a devil beast, rule 666, ruler of the world, angel, that has come now to forcibly assume or usurp the role of Christ. And for a short period, the trib they call it, the tribulation period, take control of the Middle East. But they're going to be confused by their false doctrine, led astray, and actually mistake the identity of Christ in the same inverse manner that they mistook him the first time. They expected him to come as a lion-like Messiah when he came to Israel the first time, but that wasn't the profile of Jesus in those days. So they didn't know who he was, so they killed him. He comes again as ruler, as king, as Lord of hosts. They don't know who he is, so they're going to make war against him. We know this is true. It's in Revelation 17. They make war with the Lamb, and they don't win. The people that make war with the Lamb are headed up by the church and its daughters in the day when they think Jesus is the devil, or the beast, or that description of power that comes in Revelation 17. So the pushing of the king of the south is the military operation of Christ as he begins taking control of the nations, moving from his judgment seat in Sinai with this host of people who are now blessed with immortality by a progressive conquest to his throne in Jerusalem. And that's a move northward and involves a lot of different prophetic details that we'll get into as we go from here. Can't cover them all right now. But what's really interesting about this passage is this play, this marvelous play on words, pushing, incites, rushing. And the difference between those two words is just the first letter. So I find this so amusing, like the relationship between the words spoil and oil, the relationship between the word son of righteousness, S-U-N of righteousness in Malachi, and S-O-N, the son of God, being the same thing. Well, how that come out by God's will as speaking of the same thing, sun, the center of our solar system, and the Son of God being the rising light of this world. And all the meaning, and how could that possibly be made up by men? I certainly didn't make it up. It's just there for the taking. But what's more interesting is through first Hebrew, then Vulgate, and then translated into English, these words kind of match up in a very understandable way in English. So that spoil has contained within it the word oil, and that's the wealth. Whether it's gas or oil, that's the wealth of the Middle East that all the nations are basically clamoring for. Righteousness is also Jesus and is also the rising light in the world. And pushing and rushing have this interesting interplay, especially rushing and Russia. I'm not saying that this all has some great meaning. I'm just saying that I know from this that God is in control of language. That's my point. Anybody going to disagree with that? You think God's in control of language or not? All right, let's go back to Genesis, where the story of the Tower of Babel occurred. And what happened there? God controlled language, didn't he? In fact, he controlled it by scattering it, by making it dispersed and disparate, and then people were scattered. Tim?
Just wanted to mention that the spread of the gospel throughout the world historically exploded when the Greek and the Hebrew were translated into English, and then that's when it went out.
Yeah.
That's when the word went out to the world,
Yes.
through the English language.
Yeah.
And
So
it's been translated in many, many ways since then, but it was that 15, 1600s when the big move was to bring it into English.
Yeah. So I don't think you can. I think it's let's put it this way. Between the two takes you can have on the use of words like this, the one that says it's just purely coincidental, you can't make any point prophetic interpretation out of it at all. That's the one point of view. It's just an accident of language. And the one that says God is in control of language and he can send messages to us that make everything correlate by the use of words in times, so that we kind of get the picture even stronger. I mean, how many ways can he lay it down? Like the picture of the boot, and Rome is in the center of that, and Nebuchadnezzar's image, and Sicily right at the toe of the boot, and the boot looks like it's kicking Sicily, and all these things correlating with Nebuchadnezzar's image, and the conflict at the crisis of the end when the image collapses between the stone that hits the image at the toes, at the point of the toes. All those things. Is God in control of geography, the shape of geography? Does he make messages like this? Does he lay messages in the meanings of words and the meanings of names and even their phonetic association? I think he does, and I think the reason he does is not only is he in control of every atom in the universe, but it would be an understatement to say that he's in control of language. So it's just an interesting thing that we're passing by here to notice this fascinating use of the terms pushing, incites, rushing. So let me show you the scriptures that, let's take this and fan it out a little bit to other Bible references that connect pushing to Messiah's work specifically. Okay, the first goes back to Deuteronomy 33 in the blessings of Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, and when it was all said and done, he was about to die, he blessed his sons. They were all down in Egypt now. Joseph had saved the tribes of Israel and their families. In this case, it was just at a family level. Many, it says in the account of Joseph's forgiveness, many were saved as a result. His heart was all toward their children. For 400 years they stay there and grew to a number of a couple million, and God brings them into the wilderness, and they spend 400 years in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, and then they go in and take over the land that God had promised to Abraham. It was an initial fulfillment of the promises, which, according to God, take place in series. They occur redundantly, or have, in the history of the world. But let's look at Deuteronomy 33, where specifically Jacob is blessing his son Joseph. So who is Joseph? Joseph is the son who was cast out by his brethren, who was unrecognized by them when he finally took control over them, and then forgave them and became a blessing that allowed the promises to be manifested and Israel to survive as a nation. Does that sound anything like the work of Christ? Of course it does. Joseph is an ostensible type of Christ. So this is what it says. Jacob said, "Let the blessing come upon the head of Joseph." So in this case, it was as if he had put his hand on his son's head and was now giving him a blessing. But there's a double entendre here, because Jesus is also the head of Joseph, the head of Israel, the head of his church. So when he says, "Let the blessing come upon the head of Joseph," prophetically, this means specifically this blessing applies to Christ, but it also applies to Joseph and his progeny. So in this sense, it's a type of Christ. And he says, "And upon the head of him that was separated from his brethren." So here's the way God works. Just so there's no mistaking that this is a reference to both Joseph, but predominantly to his son, he says, "And upon the head of him," that is Jesus, "who was separated from his brethren." When they killed him, he went to heaven and from the earth for a period of 2,000 years. So how does that not apply? You can see how carefully the language of this blessing applies to Christ as a type, or Joseph as a type of Christ. So he goes on to say, "His glory," get this, "is like the firstling of a bullock." That is a young bull. And what's that? What did they do under the law with the firstling of a bullock? That became the basis of the sin offering, which totally consumed flesh. That was the offering of the bullock. Its purpose was to say that God's judgments totally consumed flesh, and the bull was all burned up. What happened to Jesus when he came as the Son of Man? His flesh was totally consumed in the crucifixion when the seed of the serpent wounded his heel, bruised his heel. So he says, firstly, in the first part of the sentence, that his glory is like the firstling of his bullock. That is, meant for sacrifice. Then he says this, "And his horns are like the horns of an ox." What do the horns of an ox do? They're a threat. First, an ox is a humble servant, but when Jesus comes back, he's going to have the power and irresistible force of the horns of an ox. And then what he says in this blessing of Joseph as a type of Christ, with his horns, he shall push or interdict the people, that is the nations, together to the ends of the earth. Well, that never happened to Joseph, did it? Joseph saved Israel, yes. He was a leader in Egypt, yes. But he never took, in any kind of figure whatever, took the position of an ox with its horns, goring the people or the nations to the ends of the earth. And that word push means interdict. Interdict means to take control of forcibly. It's a military term. So let's read this again. And speaking of Jesus, or Joseph as a type of Christ, his horns, that is the strength of his head, are like the horns of an ox. With them he shall push militarily the people or the nations together to the ends of the earth. Right, so that's what Deuteronomy 33:16 and 17 says concerning the word push and the work of Christ when he comes. Let's look at Psalm 44, verses 1 through 7. You can turn to that in your own Bible and see how it reads there. It's consistent. I checked several versions. It's consistent in the New King James and in the Christian Standard. I think it's consistent in the English Standard, and it's consistent in, as I said earlier, in King James. This is what it says in the key verse, I think, 5, if I'm not mistaken. It's not that. I've lost track of which verse it is through 1 through 7, but it says, we, that is, we in the end of times have heard with our ears, and have we not? We're listening to it right now. You may think you're listening to me talk, but you're really listening to God talk in this, because we're reading what he says. I'm just reading it. In the end of times, we've heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us. In my case, that was literal. My dad told me about this, and my mom, all my life. But this refers to the fathers of Israel, the prophets and the men of Israel of old that wrote down what God said. What work thou didst in their days in times of old. So we know that when they were given this message, God was doing a work in Israel in the times of old, which was like or parallel to the work that Christ will do when he comes back. In the days of David, David killed Goliath. In the days of Christ, Christ will fell the image when he strikes the image on his feet. This is all about Daniel and the relationship between what happened in old times and how they parallel what will happen in the end of times. How thou didst drive out the nations with thy hand. That comes to us in the form of a direct prophecy in Zechariah 14, when it says that all the nations will be gathered against Jerusalem to battle, and it says the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. When was that? That's times of old. When did God fight in the day of battle? He fought through Israel. In every battle he told Israel to enter and that they would win. Jesus comes out and fight against those nations who are now coming against Israel, Jerusalem to battle. That's in Zechariah 14. It's definitely speaking about Christ, but it's a reference to the victories of old as being proof of the current victory in the time of the end. And it says they wanted the land, but they got not the land. They were after Israel. They wanted to take possession of it, but God didn't give it to him. So David says, thou art my king. David's saying this. He's not saying it to himself. He's saying it to God, and he's saying it, I think, to who he knew would be the literal king in the future that would sit on his throne. Because he had been promised a king that would sit on his throne, literally. Thou art my king, O God. Command deliverances for Jacob, that is Israel. Through thee will we push down our enemies. Now there's two things you want to notice in that. Through God, through Christ, will we, that's future tense, push down our enemies. This happens at the time when the king of the south pushes at him. So it's the pushing in this context that places the bridle in the mouth of the horse that Christ is riding. It's as if Gog is his horse, and brings him down. So that's why it says in Ezekiel 38:4, we're about done now, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army. So who's doing this? I will turn thee back. I will bring you forth. How does God do this? He does this by Christ acting as king of the south, pushing his way into the land of Israel to take claim of it forcibly as a military interdiction. It's there that he meets Gog on the mountains of Israel, and by virtue of his judgments completely destroys the armies that have come. And that is also, subsequently we'll see this, that is one of the 7 wonders. He pitches this king of the north pitches his tent in the Holy Land, but he comes to his end. This is what it says in Daniel 11, and no one can help him.